Even the most powerful leaders in the world aren't immune to awkward or cringe-worthy situations. From verbal gaffes and awkward encounters to public mishaps and dangerous incidents, these moments humanize the individuals who hold the highest office in the land. So join me for today's video. We're going to look through the top 15 most embarrassing presidential moments. Number 15. The Beast gets stuck. The Beast is the limousine that the president uses whenever they travel somewhere by road as part of a motorcade. And because it's transporting such an important and potentially targeted person, it's got a number of upgrades that you won't see on any other vehicle. These include aluminum, ceramic, and steel armor all over, multi-layered windows, a hermetically sealed cabin to protect against chemical attacks, and even a backup blood supply just in case the worst happens. With doors that weigh the same as those of a jumbo jet, these modifications have of course meant that the Cadillac is far heavier than normal, with some estimates suggesting it may weigh in excess of 20,000 pounds, and this has, on occasion, led to some difficulties. There's usually no problem when the president is traveling around the US, as the roads are wide enough to accommodate it, and the Secret Service have plenty of time to scout out the routes. But footage recorded in 2012 shows how things become trickier on the narrower streets of other countries. Barack Obama was visiting Ireland and was in Ballsbridge, where huge crowds were waiting to try to see him for themselves outside of the US Embassy, and they were excited to see the Beast approach to exit through the gate. Unfortunately, the ramp it needed to pass over wasn't designed to handle such a long and heavy vehicle, so when it had partly crossed, the limo got stuck, and a tow truck had to be sent to pull it free. After the event, the Secret Service claimed the president wasn't actually in the vehicle at the time and had instead used a different exit. But it was still an unfortunate event that showed no matter how advanced and powerful the presidential vehicle is, all the effort was undone by a simple bump in the road. Number 14. Trump shoe. With all the benefits that come from being president, there are some serious sacrifices too. One of which being you instantly become one of the most famous and photographed people on the planet, and every move you make in public is being watched. That's what Donald Trump learned in late 2018, and while he certainly wasn't shy of the camera, journalists managed to capture footage of an unfortunate event that he would have probably preferred to have forgotten. He had just given a speech and had been taken back to the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport to board Air Force One to fly back to Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, though, no one had checked the president's appearance before he made his way to the aircraft, and eagle-eye observers quickly noticed that he had a sheet of toilet paper stuck on the bottom of one of his shoes. Things proceeded to get worse as he climbed the stairs and the paper fluttered in the wind, and unsurprisingly, it became the headline of the news cycle that evening. To make it even funnier, this wasn't the only time this happened to him, as almost exactly a year later he was photographed again with tissue on his shoe as he walked to Marine One after giving a speech on Wall Street. It's almost as if to avoid this type of embarrassment, he needed an aide whose sole job it was to check his shoes before he walked anywhere. Number 13. Joe Biden versus staircase. Presidents, of course, have a jam-packed schedule that sees them go from meetings to press conferences to important events all throughout the day, and a large part of this involves traveling across huge distances. This would prove to be tough for most people, but presidents aren't normally the youngest of people either, so an active day can leave them feeling physically exhausted, something they certainly wouldn't want to show in public. As the oldest president ever, though, Joe Biden hasn't exactly been short of examples of his occasional frailty, and this video was broadcast around the world in December of 2021. He was boarding Air Force One in the morning to take flight to Atlanta to meet with community leaders in the wake of an awful mass shooting. But as he made his way up the stairs, he managed to fall over not once, not twice, but 3 times. Luckily, he managed to regain his composure by the time he reached the top and was able to give a salute before stepping inside. Later, it was announced that he was perfectly fine and hadn't been injured, but in many ways the damage had already been done. In Biden's defense, others that had been there that day mentioned how it was a particularly blustery morning and that most people there were struggling to keep their footing in the conditions, making it arguably unfair that the president was ridiculed so much for it.
I'm not going nuts.
Number 12. Nixon's resignation. As the leader of the free world, the office of the president is one that's looked up to by people from across the planet, and it's vital that the president and those surrounding them conduct themselves in the appropriate way to maintain the integrity of such a highly regarded position. With that in mind, one of the darkest days of the presidency took place on August the 8th of 1974, when a speech was broadcast from the Oval Office, and Richard Nixon announced his resignation. This, of course, had nothing to do with failing health or any other noble reason as to why he was standing down, but instead because of the Watergate scandal, in which the president and his administration attempted to cover up their involvement 2 years earlier in a burglary that took place at the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. In the time after the scandal, Nixon, who had been fairly popular up until that point, began to plummet in the polls and lost many of his political allies. It was a complete disaster for the president, and he actually became the only U.S. president to have ever resigned from office. Even this, though, wasn't as honorable as an act as it may seem, because rather than it happening because he knew he had made a mistake and was taking responsibility for it, he only decided to resign because he found out that he was almost certainly going to be impeached and wanted to avoid the trial. It was such a monumental event in American politics that still to this day people name scandals after Watergate, and it surely remains the most shamefully embarrassing presidential moment of all time. Number 11. Shoe thrown at George W. Bush. George W. Bush found himself leading the United States during one of the toughest periods in the country's history and would become a controversial figure around the world because of some of the tough decisions he made in the years following the 9/11 atrocity. The act that stands out the most was the choice to send troops into Iraq, but by 2008 a new government had been installed, and he was in Baghdad to give a press conference with Iraq's new leader. At first, everything seemed to begin in the normal way, but suddenly Bush was forced to duck to avoid a shoe that had been hurled at him. A moment later, another shoe flew across the room and hit the American flag. It was quick thinking by the president to move out of the way and avoid the image of him being hit by a shoe being broadcast around the world, but the fact that it happened at all will still be remembered as an embarrassing moment for him. The act of throwing shoes at leaders has become quite common in the years since as a political protest, and particularly in the Arab world, this happens because they're considered to be unclean. The man who threw them at Bush, a journalist called Muntadar al-Zaidi, also shouted, "This is a farewell kiss from the Iraqi people, you dog," and "This is for the widows and orphans of all those killed in Iraq," before being tackled to the ground and punched and kicked by security guards. As a result, he spent the next 9 months in prison, but for Bush, the incident will stay with him for a lifetime. Number 10. Obama takes the oath 4 times. There is, of course, a huge amount of responsibility that comes with being the President of the United States, and not only does it mean becoming the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and being responsible for making decisions that will affect every citizen on a day-to-day basis, but it also involves a responsibility for upholding the values of the Constitution and acting in an honorable way towards the position of President. After years of campaigning during a particularly brutal election process, the nation is meant to be brought back together at the inauguration, when the newly elected president recites an oath swearing to keep to these ideals. But this isn't simply a ceremonial process, but an important constitutional one. For this reason, the oath needs to be said precisely, and if it's not, it needs to be done again. Amazingly, Barack Obama actually had to give the oath a total of 4 times, despite being president for the maximum limit of 2 terms. It may seem embarrassing, but neither of the issues were his fault at all, but he remains the only president who had to repeat the oath twice at the start of each of his terms. At his inauguration on January 20th, 2009, House Chief Justice John Roberts made a mistake in the words he was reading out for the new president to say back to him. And as a result of this, they had to meet up the following day on the 21st to go through it again. For his second term, to avoid this mistake again, the Chief Justice sent Barack Obama a card with the precise wording ahead of time. But this time, it was a completely different reason that meant the oath was said twice again. Traditionally, the swearing-in ceremony takes place on the 20th of January, but in 2013, this date fell on a Sunday. The public event was therefore scheduled for Monday, so on the 20th, the President and Chief Justice met in private to conduct it on the correct date, and then they repeated it for the event the following day. Number 9. The glowing orb. Presidents, like all people in the public eye, they often find themselves needing to pose for photographs so journalists can document important speeches and meetings. But in May of 2017, Donald Trump found himself taking part in what's possibly the most bizarre and embarrassing presidential photo call of all. He was on the first stop of an international trip visiting Saudi Arabia. The main purpose of being there was to tighten up the relationship with the country, particularly in regards to eliminating international terrorism. And what better place to do so than the newly opened Global Center for Combating Extremist Ideology? He was with King Salman of Saudi Arabia and President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, and had given what will be remembered as an awkward speech about Islam, but surprisingly not one that was seen as too controversial. It was towards the end of several days in the country, during which there had been a number of other strange moments, including him taking part in a traditional sword dance and driving to a Toby Keith concert in a golf cart with the Saudi king. But it was the pose that the three leaders took at the Anti-Terrorism Center opening that'll be remembered as the weirdest. For some reason, there was a glowing globe in the center of the room, which looked more like an orb. All three leaders placed their hands on it. As images of the moment began to spread around the world, it was soon pointed out how it looked like a team of villains plotting in their lair than the three powerful leaders putting their differences aside on the world stage. And it became the source of online ridicule for days after the event. Number 8. Gerald Ford trips on stairs. Air Force One is known the world over as the most advanced aircraft that takes to the skies, and is a beacon of the U.S. presidency wherever it travels. It seems, though, that despite all the advanced technology that's packed within this customized Boeing 747, very little thought has been put into how the president gets into it, and difficulties climbing the stairs are by no means something that only recent presidents have encountered. On the 1st of June 1975, Air Force One had landed on the tarmac at Salzburg, Austria, for Gerald Ford to meet with local leaders. It was a typical windy and rainy day, so the President and First Lady emerged from the aircraft with an umbrella that he was holding over her to keep her dry. Unfortunately, he was probably focusing on this a little too much, and by the time he reached the bottom, he slipped and fell to his hands. It's possible he would have completely fallen to the ground had the people next to him not grabbed hold of him. But despite being something that we've all done similar to in our lives, Ford was unfortunate in that so many cameras were trained on him at the time. This was one of those seemingly minor moments that history looks back on, and it affected the rest of his presidency. Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live went straight for the jugular, making fun of the president, and despite being fit and healthy and regularly skiing and playing golf, Ford soon became labeled as being clumsy and accident-prone. Ford took it in good humor, though, and still managed to get his own back on Chevy Chase. At the radio and television correspondents' dinner later that year, he tugged the tablecloth of the comedian's table as he walked up to the stage, which sent the table flying in Chevy Chase's direction before saying, "I'm Gerald Ford, and you're not." Moving on to number 7. George W. Bush's neck massage. Despite seemingly living a life of luxury where they're wined and dined in some of the most exclusive places around the world and treated to huge ceremonial banquets, leaders spend huge amounts of time with one another to thrash out deals and agreements, and sometimes they can get a little too friendly. Who knows what actually happens behind closed doors, but there are some actions that certainly don't play well on the public stage. And George W. Bush learned this the difficult way in 2006. He had been attending that year's G8 summit in St. Petersburg, which had a particularly important week in which the most powerful countries on Earth had a chance to align their international policies, particularly with the continuing war on terror. As the leaders emerged in front of the press corps for a photo op, President Bush stood behind Angela Merkel, the then Chancellor of Germany, and appeared to start giving her a neck massage. Aware that she was being filmed, Merkel threw her arms in the air in disgust and clearly looked uncomfortable at the whole thing, while Bush simply walked on by. For weeks afterwards, this brief moment was fiercely debated in Germany and the US, with commentators trying to work out what they had just seen. Was this a tender moment between two people who had forged a close bond and she was playing to the cameras, or was there something more sinister to it? It was suggested that it was purposeful on Bush's part in an attempt to diminish Germany's role on the international stage, but in the US there were questions surrounding whether it was harassment. To make matters worse, it was found that in the UN guidelines, a neck massage is specifically said to be an inappropriate gesture, but in hindsight, he sadly isn't exactly the worst offender with this type of behavior from presidents in recent history. Number 6. The most dangerous golf tournament. Presidents of the United States seem to have a strange affinity with playing golf, largely because it's a relaxing outdoor pursuit that's good exercise and gives plenty of opportunity to talk with people. But not every round of golf goes exactly to plan. In fact, based on events in 1995, you might be best off staying far away from any golf course where there's a president who's about to tee off. Every year, the Bob Hope Chrysler Classic Golf Tournament, which is known as the American Express, is held in Southern California. While it is a professional tournament, there's also a Pro-Am round where the famous guests are invited onto the course. In the 1995 event, history was made when Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Gerald Ford all played, marking the first time a sitting president had played during a PGA Tour event, and probably also the first time that three presidents have ever played together. History will always remember it as that, but the truth is, things didn't exactly go to plan, and it should probably be remembered as one of the most dangerous games of golf ever. The first incident happened when former President Bush struck a ball that ricocheted off a tree and then struck a female spectator in the forehead, which knocked her glasses to the ground and caused an injury that began to bleed. Soon after, another strike by Bush managed to hit a different spectator on their backside, and then Ford had a shot that hit someone on their shoulder and another that split someone's finger. Clinton too hit a ball into the crowd, but luckily for him, as the sitting president, it's not thought to have injured anyone. The crowd at the time found it more funny than frightening, though, and those who were injured got to meet the presidents afterwards. It's probably because of this, though, that they weren't all invited back the following year. Number 5. Covfefe. Regardless of what you may think of his political beliefs or behavior, there's no denying that Donald Trump became the first president to show just how powerful social media can be. With his use of Twitter, he managed to sidestep the usual avenues through which information is shared with the public from the White House, and gave the impression at least that he was using his account to speak directly with the public and his supporters. Anyone else in this situation with such a high profile would test every sentence they're about to send with the team around them to ensure it conveys the right message and can't be misinterpreted. But Trump became known for his late-night posts and unedited thoughts, which brought him closer with some people and drove him further away from others. Of all the tweets he published during his presidency, though, there's one that stands out as the most confusing and embarrassing, and it was broadcast to the world at 6 minutes after midnight on May 31, 2017. It simply said, "Despite the constant negative press, covfefe." The confusing word at the end of the tweet soon meant that it had gone viral like nothing before, and not only had it been retweeted 105,000 times that day, but the hashtag covfefe was used more than 1.4 million times since his tweet. Everyone, journalists and voters alike, went into overdrive trying to decipher what it meant. Did he misspell coverage, or was something else going on? The response of the then press secretary Sean Spicer didn't help matters, as at one point he said, "I think the president and a small group of people know exactly what he meant," and then later said it was intentional and not a typo. The buzz around the tweet was so great that it surpassed talks surrounding the Paris Climate Agreement that Trump said the US would withdraw from. And still, to this day it remains one of his most popular tweets, one of the most viewed on Twitter itself, and the one that Trump has never actually publicly explained. Number 4. Mission accomplished. George W. Bush was elected in 2000 and sworn in as president in January of 2001. At the time, it seemed like a business as usual, as he had been voted in on a platform of compassionate conservatism, and in many ways, most people expected him to captain a ship that was already doing quite well. And you're left with the choice of whether to go through with it to avoid any awkwardness, or somehow find a way to get out of it. Everyday social interactions like this become far trickier when you're the President of the United States, because the eyes of the world watch everything you do and look for meaning in it all. It's crucial that a president doesn't show friendliness when it isn't deserved or be dismissive towards supposed allies, and Barack Obama found himself in a particularly strange position when he visited Cuba. Setting foot on Cuban soil was a major step towards cooling relation in itself, and amazingly, he was the first president to do so since Calvin Coolidge in 1922. This was a mission of optimism to develop new bonds with one of the country's closest neighbors. On the final day of the 3-day visit, both leaders gave a press conference where they discussed difficult topics like human rights and democracy, and both seemed a little irritable, with Obama standing strong on the problems with Cuba's record on these things, and Castro going on the defensive. It showed there was still a long way to go with relations, and Obama needed to make this clear with his interactions, which is why things reached a whole different level of awkwardness when Castro went in for a handshake. Even today, no one's entirely sure how such a strange combination of hands and forearms happened, but as Castro tried to take Obama's hand and raise it into the air, the president's arm instead went limp, and he did everything he could to avoid it. In later interviews, the staff at the White House suggested that it was clear Castro was looking for an iconic photo moment, but the president in no way wanted to imply there was more agreement than there actually was, and had no choice but to react in this way. In the end, Obama's reaction proved to be perfect, because although it certainly created some embarrassing and strange-looking videos and images, Castro didn't get the game-changing image he was clearly looking for. Number 2. Trump shoves a prime minister. There's no doubt that the President of the US is one of, if not the most powerful person on the planet. And you see the results of this wherever they go. The focus is always on them, whichever room they're in, but things can be a little more delicate when they're abroad. Foreign leaders aren't afraid to make their opinions known when they're talking to the president, and rightly or wrongly expect everyone to be treated equally when they're at summits together. President Trump, though, clearly channeled the importance of himself and of the presidency at every opportunity, and this created an awkward diplomatic moment in May of 2017. He was at a NATO summit in Brussels and had already been very critical of the organization, especially the way it was funded, in the lead-up to this event. By all accounts, there were heated discussions between the leaders behind closed doors, but as is customary when summits like these draw to a close, all of the attendees are expected to walk out in front of the cameras for a group shot. When Trump came out, he seemed to have found himself stuck behind Duško Marković, who was the Prime Minister of Montenegro. And even if the correct position was for the president to be stood at the front, you'd normally expect them to have a quiet word to ask to be let through. In typical Trump style, though, he instead looked annoyed and pulled Markovic's shoulder backward before pushing past him, almost as if he expected everyone to know where he was at all times. Number 1. George H.W. Bush and the Japanese Prime Minister. Of all the embarrassing presidential moments that have ever taken place, we have without a doubt kept the best one for last. It is an unfortunate honor that belongs to George Bush Sr., and it took place on January 8th of 1992 when he was in Japan. He had begun that year with a trade-focused tour around Asia and the Pacific, with a particular emphasis on defining America's role in the aftermath of the Cold War, and this was his last stop in Japan. Earlier on in the day, he played tennis alongside the U.S. ambassador against Emperor Akihito and his son, and the Japanese royalty won, which meant things were going well for relations. It would all take an unexpected turn later on, though, as Bush went to a lavish banquet at the Japanese Prime Minister's official residence, with 135 diplomats also there. It was a great chance for people from both sides to put their points across and to hopefully build relations and agree on some deals. And also the last chance the American delegation had to enjoy their time away before returning to the U.S., where the presidential primaries were about to begin for the election that year. Between the second and third courses of the dinner, however, President Bush fainted in his chair and at the same time leant over and vomited into the lap of the Japanese Prime Minister. In a moment of panic, the First Lady was able to cover his mouth with a napkin, even though the Prime Minister had already been covered in vomit, and the Secret Service members rushed in to take over. Bush was laid on the floor so his physician could check him over, and apparently jokingly asked his doctor to roll him under the table until the dinner was over. His wife then had to give a speech later on in the evening in his place, and it was later reported that he had been suffering from a case of intestinal flu. He was, of course, ridiculed for what happened once he had returned home, and it, in part, led to the development of a narrative that he wasn't strong enough to remain as president. There were, of course, more pressing matters that would ultimately lead to Bill Clinton beating him in the '92 election, so this incident became more memorable as one of his last international events, and one that he was continuously reminded of many years after it happened. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you to our channel members.